Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture podcast where we talk about everything dog. Q&As with veterinarian professionals, rescue operators, everyday topics. We cover everything dog on this podcast. So make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture podcast on your favorite podcast platform and make sure you're following us on social media on both Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Now here's that next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast. This is your host, Brittany, and we are joined today by Daniel Schulof. He's the CEO of Keto Natural Pet Foods, and we are talking about the class action lawsuit against Hill's Pet Nutrition. So thank you for joining us, Daniel.
My pleasure. It's good to be back.
So a lot of people probably don't know about this lawsuit. It's pretty new. It's still in very much the early stages. So give us a high-level overview of what this class action lawsuit is about, and then we're going to dig into the claims, the key players, and some of the details.
Sure. So the subject matter of the lawsuit is the controversy over canine dilated cardiomyopathy and whether or not that disease is caused by any specific class of pet food products. Listeners may remember that in 2018, there was a big, pet food doesn't make national news too often, but in 2018 it did because the United States FDA kind of out of the blue said, we're launching an investigation to figure out whether grain-free pet foods are causing dogs to develop this disease, dilated cardiomyopathy. Now, the disease is horrible. It is a often fatal disease, involves the most important organ in the body, the heart, and it is a real disease that really does kill dogs. And so when the FDA says, we're looking at whether this huge class of products, something that millions of pet owners around the country feed to their dogs every day, is causing a often fatal disease, that's a big deal. And national news outlets treated it as such, like New York Times and the Washington Post, they all covered it. And it generated a firestorm of interest around this topic as pet owners, veterinarians, and the rest of the public kind of scrambled to understand, whoa, what's going on here? Over the years that followed, it went from being a, whoa, what's going on here, to something that coalesced into like, folks there definitely formed a group of people that came to believe that there is evidence that these products cause this disease, and that it therefore, because their belief as such, led to like big changes in the market as lots of folks abandoned these kinds of products out of fears that they would give their dog this disease. Our lawsuit alleges that it not only was it much ado about nothing, but that it was fraud. That there was, in essence, fraud that induced the FDA to launch the investigation. And we filed a lawsuit against the parties that carried out the fraudulent scheme. They include a big national pet food company called Hill's Pet Nutrition, who's one of the primary beneficiaries of the scheme as the DCM controversy caught fire and folks fled from grain-free pet food products. They largely fled to Hill's products and products like Hill's that were, exempt from the worries about DCM. The lawsuit is filed against them, as well as a cluster of related people and organizations that help them carry it out. These are academic veterinarians. There are 5 individuals. They're veterinarians working at big research universities, and then 2 nonprofit organizations that are affiliated with Hill's. And in our lawsuit, we outlined the different parts that they all played, but they all kind of were working for the same goal, which is to promote the false idea that these products that Hill's competes with increase the risk of developing DCM. So yeah, that's the lawsuit in a nutshell.
Yeah. And I think it's important for listeners to know, while this is kind of the first in its class with respect to pet food, we've seen this happen with our nutrition as humans, when the FDA, years ago, the attack was on fat. We had an attack on cholesterol. I think you have seen it repeatedly. We have bad actors who are acting in their own interest, pursuing these different studies, we'll put that in air quotes, in order to prove a point to further themselves in the market. And so we've seen it time and time again. And so this did raise a big red flag, because how often, like you said, do we see, these major players coming out talking about dog food? You never hear about dog food. And when I heard about it, so I've always fed, well, with a caveat and an asterisk, I started gluten free and then I moved grain free, which that's kind of a differentiation I don't think a lot of people understand is not all grains have gluten. There's certainly a difference in grain free, gluten free, and we won't necessarily get into any of those caveats. But I know as a pet owner myself, I got a little bit worried when I saw it and I started to look into it. And I
Sure.
was like, I don't think there's merit here. This doesn't make much sense to me. And one of the vets I was seeing at the time, he was like, I don't know about these studies. I mean, he kind of pointed to who conducted the studies and who benefited from the studies. And so that alone kind of told me what I needed to know. And I just brushed it under the rug. But millions of pet owners were like, oh, no, 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 no. We can't do any of these specialty diets. And we're going to go back to those major players, kind of like you were saying. And
Yeah,
so,
it's inarguable the like impression that it had on the market. Like
yeah.
it's huge. Hill's Pet Nutrition is a publicly traded. They're a division of Colgate Palmolive, so all their financial information is publicly available. In the 5 years leading up to the launch of the FDA's investigation, Hill's revenues were dead flat. So over
Mm-hmm.
5 years, they grew a total of 1%. So very little. All right. Over the
Right.
same period of time, the overall US pet food market grew by more than like 30%. So they're hemorrhaging market share during that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Since the FDA launched its investigation, Hill's revenues have grown faster, arguably faster than any pet food company in the world. Okay. They've
Mm-hmm.
almost doubled in the 5 years since the investigation was launched. So, like, it's difficult to imagine a more abrupt turnaround that coincided any more closely with exactly this thing that would, you know, if you take a look at it for 2 seconds, you go, who's going to win if this happens? It's like, oh, well, the Hills and Purina and kind of like a cluster of other traditional pet food companies. And
Mm-hmm.
that's precisely what happened.
And I was looking at some of the Hills' financial backings and their significant funding to the American Veterinary Medical Association, and kind of thought about, a lot of vets, when you're there, they'll push Hills, whether it's because they get a kickback or, I know that there's different kind of like nonprofit derivatives of Hills. And some of those nonprofits have some heavy hands and some heavy funding with some of the vets and the vet organizations. But I think all of us have been recommended at some point in time Hill's Pet Nutrition when we've been in the vet. This is the best for their kidney disease, their liver disease, whatever the vet tells you. And you always just anticipate that it's true and correct. And
Yeah,
unfortunately, yeah.
they're the number one vet recommended brand in the country. So
Hmm.
it's not a surprise that that's happened to you multiple times. It's happened to me as well. These are products that they actually got sued somewhat recently over describing them as prescription diets
Hmm.
because they're actually not. You don't need a prescription in order to get them, and
Right.
a thoughtful class action lawyer actually sued them over it. But they are like what they call therapeutic. They're diets that they can in their marketing refer to disease treatment, disease outcomes. They can say things like kidney diet. And generally speaking, when you sell pet food or food products more broadly, you can't do that. The FDA doesn't want you to do that. Those are drug claims. I can't make
Hmm.
Dan's anti-COVID dog food. That's not allowed by the FDA. But they
Right.
have exceptions if it's sold by veterinarians. And so Hills, which had this like big veterinary recommendation network dating back to the 1980s, that's kind of their business model, is distributing through veterinarians,
Hmm.
developed a product line that is all about supposedly about treating individual diseases.
Hmm.
Um, and they're carried very widely. They're by far the biggest player in the therapeutic diet space, and they're carried by many veterinarians. And as we highlight in
Right.
the lawsuit, that's one of the fact that they then have a relationship with all these veterinary clinics where their sales reps are in their offices. The veterinarians are profiting from selling the products. The scheme, the broader scheme, not just involving DCM, but involving how Hills creates the information environment that veterinarians swim in, is cataloged in the lawsuit, but it's like impressive in an evil genius way. I mean, it's so comprehensive. You've highlighted already really well that, like, it's an unfortunate reality that in this day and age, big business uses its influence to kind of pervert, to kind of corrupt institutions like the professional practice of science that had traditionally been sources of getting closer to the truth for human civilization. Like that's what
Hmm.
science does. These days, whether it's oil companies and climate change, cigarette companies and lung cancer, or pet food companies and DCM, these big organizations are using these institutions that have historically been very useful, and perverting them to their own needs by essentially putting out propaganda. And as we highlight in the lawsuit, Hills does it as well as anybody in the world. One
Hmm.
thing that makes the veterinary nutrition community unique is that it's small. There are
Hmm.
100,000 vets in the country, but there are only about 100 board certified veterinary nutritionists, 100 people. It's not too hard if you're a $4 billion a year company to actively form a financial relationship with every single one of those people. So it's like that's not an unrealistic goal. And the reality is, like, between, even if you're every one of the veterinary nutritionists in the country isn't one of your full-time paid employees, there are a million other ways. And again, as we catalog in the lawsuit, that you can exert financial or in other kinds of pressure on these people and help. And they're the only ones putting out information that the rest of the veterinary world swims in, whether it's in textbooks, whether it's in peer-reviewed papers, whether it's in media appearances, continuing education courses, whatever it is. It's like those 100 people. And if you can control and like the narrative of what those people are putting out there, you can successfully influence the entire veterinary community by doing that. And
Hmm.
that's been a business practice for Hills since the 1980s.
Right. So if we kind of dig into some of the claims, which we've been loosely talking about, one thing that was interesting was the proposition of BEG diets, BEG. So boutique, exotic, and grain-free, which essentially encapsulates all of the smaller dog food companies. If we want to throw out the word boutique is almost anyone that falls under Hill's Pet Nutrition. So this was truly an attack on any of the small players in the dog food world. And you and I were talking off air how exotic and grain free are not really one and of the same. Those are pretty
Yeah,
separate. And many of these quote unquote boutique diets, which I don't know if I would even consider some of them boutique diets, but they don't equate to a grain-free diet per se. And so it was a very interesting attack, and I think it really showed the motive, and not placing blame or pointing fingers, because obviously this hasn't been adjudicated. But I think it really kind of shows the level of the perhaps bad faith in some of these studies.
100%. So to make sure that everybody that's listening understands what Brittany's talking about, the FDA, when it announced its investigation, sort of loosely defined the types of products it was looking at. But in the wake of the FDA announcing its investigation, the defendants in the lawsuit, the veterinarians who really are the ones who perpetrated this thing, they appeared in the media and they put out their own influential media stuff that was in public facing blogs, but also in academic papers. And one of those people, and you might call, like, I mean, she's certainly the most notable of the group. She is the most high profile and has done the most active stuff in this case. Her name is Lisa Freeman. She's a professor at Tufts University. She coined an acronym to describe the types of products that she was allegedly worried we're going to give dogs DCM. And it's the acronym you just used, BEG diets. So this wasn't something the FDA came out with. But like shortly after the FDA announced its investigation, Lisa Freeman put out her own blog post that said, I'm paraphrasing, but the headline was, "It's not just grain-free." And it outlined what additional products beyond grain-free she was saying are at fault here. And as you said, BEG refers to boutique, meaning is made clear in other places, anything under $1 billion a year in sales, exotic ingredient, which includes things like salmon, okay, or grain-free. All of those products, Lisa Freeman would have you believe, are likely to are at to blame for the the non-existent DCM spike. And it's notable that that group is notable for a few reasons. The most to me, the most notable and the one that like caught my attention and really made me suspicious that there was something going on here is that it's incredibly diverse. It's like saying like the types of products that fall within that very broad group includes everything from all meat diets to zero meat diets, raw diets, kibble diets, homemade diets, $999 million a year brands. Okay. So it's like all kinds of diversity. And there's just no way that any scientist operating with an ounce of integrity can look at that diverse group and say there's some common quality there at play that's giving rise to DCM. That's just so obviously not the case. The only thing those products have in common is that they all compete with hills. Like that is kind of like and that's why that I presume that is why the acronym was chosen. But there's simply, and it's never been put, even Dr. Freeman hasn't said, well, the thing is, all those products are X, Y, and Z, and therefore that my theory is that they all give. No, there's none of that even attempted because it's like there's just simply nothing you could come up with. And so just like you, I was struck when that acronym started getting used, like by not just like, oh, this doesn't make sense, but like, this is so obviously wrong that it's indicative that there's something else going on here. And it's one of a cluster of things that made me suspicious about it from the beginning and led me to file a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that like gave rise to the documents that ultimately are the evidence upon which the lawsuit is based. It's kind of like it just kickstarted my interest in the controversy.
I think Dr. Freeman was even quoted, or perhaps it was in an interview, and she said that raw diets were inherently dangerous for dogs. Raw diets would kill your dog, or there was some exacerbated claim. And then someone asked with respect to the studies, and she said, oh, well, I actually have no scientific evidence. I have no support behind this, but raw diets are bad. And
So
so
it's highlighted in the complaint too, because it's like what you see is that the DCM controversy is just like they're running a play from a playbook that they've run before. The same people, the same organizations, and the same overall strategy has been used before. They just went a bit further this time by really leaning on the FDA, and they got so much attention because the FDA got a lot of attention. But yeah, you're exactly right. In the past, in like the early 2000s, there was another group of products that was eating Hill's market share, and it was raw diets at the time. And the very same people, Dr. Freeman was like the crusader within the veterinary nutrition community that developed a counter narrative about why those products are all bad. Just like she would later do with regard to BEG diets and DCM. She said, in essence, raw diets are bad because there's the possibility that they're going to get contaminated with foodborne pathogens. Therefore, nobody should feed these products to their pets. And to this day, I say this all the time, is like when I'm talking to somebody, a layperson, about industry influence in veterinary nutrition community, I will constantly say, like, go to your vet and ask your vet what they think of raw diets. I will make a bet with you today that I will give you a year free Keto Natural Pet Foods if your vet says anything other than Number one, we know that there's no evidence suggesting that raw diets do anything good for a dog. And number two, we know that there's evidence that they could raise the risk of foodborne pathogens. Therefore, we don't recommend those diets. That is like a script that has gotten, it's so ubiquitous that I offer that bet all the time. And the reason it's so ubiquitous is because it just got hammered into veterinarians using the same kinds of channels, the same kind of strategies, putting out bad faith stuff in peer-reviewed journals, using continuing education courses, being influential in what kind of material goes into textbooks, all that stuff 20 years ago. And then they literally just ran it back with DCM. And so they knew how to do it. But for those of us who have been watching, know how to recognize it as well. And so it kind of cut both ways.
Yeah, so your little wager there on vets and raw diets. So I actually have one of my 4 dogs eats raw. And the 3 vets that he has seen, because we have a couple of vets depending on what we're going for, they're like, oh, well, it's bad. And I'm like, oh, how so? And they're like, well, one of the vets said, well, if he were to lick you, you might get salmonella. And I'm like, what?
There you go.
That is the most absurd thing that I've ever heard. That's truly your reasoning. Like, I was astonished, because if you look at his blood work or anything about this dog, it's perfect. And so I'm like, I'd love to show me on paper where this diet is bad, especially like in Florida, raw diets are very hydrating, and they can kind of keep your dog hydrated. So a lot of work dogs, bite dogs, dogs that are in service might eat raw to keep them a little more hydrated. And that's a whole other topic, but that just kind of speaks to this whole to this whole lawsuit. And even, my one dog that does eat the keto kibble, I've had a few vets, they're like, oh, dogs can't do keto. And I'm like, why not? Because and I cite to the benefits for cognitive repair, not even like helping cognitive ability, but also it's been led to shown repair. But then also the benefits on a lot of health elements with respect to cancer and different things like that, and how getting a dog into ketosis and or just having less carbohydrates can be beneficial. And most vets are like, I don't think so, but they don't have anything else for me,
Yeah. I mean, there are a million things that gives rise, all that gives rise to. It's like, number one, it's really interesting that your vet, with respect to raw diets, framed it as, if your dog licks you, you could get salmonella. It's like, that is the way that the risk of raw diets has been presented to the veterinary community. And the reason for that is because dogs are generally very asymptomatic about that stuff. Like, they have a huge history of eating raw meat, and they've over time evolved the capacity to deal with that stuff without too much issue. It's not the case that salmonella results in the same kind of symptomology typically with a dog as it does with a person. And so, to say to the veterinary community, we need to watch out for raw diets because of contamination with stuff like salmonella, you need to be able to say, and therefore somebody could get sick, but dogs don't get sick. So they had to frame it up as well, if you come into contact with your dog's feces, or if your dog licks you, or if you don't use good sanitation procedures, that's how it had to be framed. That's how tenuous the downside of it is. Now, on the other hand, the upside of it is also very clever and tricky. It's they are 100% technically correct in saying there's really no evidence that raw diets are better for dogs. Right. And the reason that's technically correct is that I agree with them that simply being raw is not really been shown to offer any kind of health benefits. There's some arguments that you cook food in a certain kind of way and the nutritional content changes a little bit. It doesn't really hold water if you scrutinize it.
Right.
But most raw diets, not all, but most, have a really different nutritional makeup to most kibble products. Most kibble is 40 to 50% carbohydrate, 25% protein. Many raw diets are twice that much protein and very little carbohydrate. So it's technically true to say, well, there's no evidence suggesting raw is better. That's true, but it ignores the elephant in the room, which is that the nutritional content of these diets very often is completely better. And so, like,
Right.
it just shows this kind of willingness to accept a very facially valid, but like you just pick under the surface by a quarter inch and you can see that it's nonsense type
Yeah.
of stuff in the veterinary community. Like that the fact that that's become so ubiquitous is egg on the face of the veterinary community. Like there's just no, you sympathize with these clearly very smart people, America's vets, that are being, led around by very powerful, very wealthy organizations with tons of credibility and clout, and that it's hard to get outside your little information bubble. But there are times when I'm unable to like muster that. You know what I mean? Where you just have to go like, you as a professional need to be able to do better than this. Like to
Right.
this day, I get potential customers. We make very low carb dog food. One of the places where that has a lot of usefulness for pet owners is if their dog has diabetes. Because as I'm sure you know, diabetes is essentially carbohydrate. You're allergic to carbohydrate. Your dog's body can't process carbohydrate sufficiently. It's the mechanisms that you usually use to process it don't work.
Right.
In the veterinary community, if dog with diabetes, the standard of care is to prescribe a Hill's Pet Nutrition product that is 40% digestible carbohydrate. And so it's like, it might, if you're comparing it with a diet that's 50% digestible
Right.
carbohydrate, it's a little better, but like, it's nowhere near as good as just getting rid of the carbs altogether. So our product, very low in carbohydrate content. Dogs have diabetes, switch on our product. Lo and behold, they have phenomenal results. Who could have guessed? What I get to this day, and this is like, you can't summon any kind of sympathy because it's just like not sufficiently professional, is people go, I've been on your food. My dog's been on your food for a year. Really great. We use way less insulin. His diabetes is so much easier to manage. Thank you. It's great. But here's the thing. I brought him to his annual checkup at the vet, and the vet found out that, he said, has diabetes. This is great. We're managing it really well. And they said, what are you using? Oh, Keto Natural Pet Foods. Are you worried? You should be worried about DCM. Basically, they will essentially say to pet owners, what's more important than this disease that your dog has is this potential thing that we've been led to believe about this other disease that your dog doesn't have, and discourage people from using. Isn't that incredible? Like that is like, oh my God. And it's very hard for me to sympathize with that.
Yeah. It's there's a lot we could say. We won't point any more fingers.
Yeah.
So this lawsuit, it's pretty new. We still don't have any responses to the complaint itself. Will you guys be keeping an update on your website, kind of blog post or something to kind of let people know what's going on with the lawsuit?
Yep. We'll be doing everything that we can to kind of, anytime you have litigation, there's some degree of like confidentiality, strategic stuff that you like might not want to share because it's like this adversarial thing where you're having a fight over the truth with somebody. And like, but we're very motivated. Like, a good outcome of this lawsuit is that folks generally, whether they're lay people or, God willing, the veterinary community, understand the facts that emerge from the lawsuit and go and second guess some of the stuff that they've taken as an article of faith so far in their practice, that they go a little bit more skeptically at new information that smells off. And so it's very important for me to appear on shows like yours, to talk to folks about what our allegations are, what the status of the fight looks like. And so, yeah, we'll be doing that. Litigation takes a long time, unfortunately, you know this. But it does have like, key moments in it. There are like intermediate steps between the filing of a lawsuit and the day that it's finally all said and done that are really notable and newsworthy in and of themselves. And so making the rounds, talking to the folks whose audiences are interested in this stuff, and highlighting the latest developments is something I'm going to be motivated to do in the months and unfortunately years ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to kind of follow this and see what happens, and see, this might change the trajectory of the dog health care, health, wellness, dog food industry as we know it. So appreciate your knowledge on this and kind of taking the bull by the horns. And as always, thank you for being a guest on the Canine Culture podcast.
My pleasure. I would be happy to come back on as often as you'll have me. There's nothing that gives me nothing I enjoy more than just kind of talking about this sort of stuff. There's so much to say. So
yeah,
thanks for having
absolutely.
me.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in to the Canine Culture podcast. Please make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media. If you have any recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear, if you know of any guests that would be good for the show, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please reach out to us. Send us an email at canineculturepodcast@gmail.com, or send us a direct message on social media. Thank you for listening, and please share this with any of your dog-loving friends.